The sun hung low over the Montana plains that afternoon, and Thomas Wade had been working his ranch for near about 40 years now, and he thought he'd seen just about everything life could throw at a man. But he was wrong about that. The two girls came stumbling up his dirt road just past 3 o'clock, and Thomas was mending fence near the gate when he spotted them. And at first he thought maybe they were lost hikers from that new trail the county put in last spring. But as they got closer, he could see something was terribly wrong. They were twins, he realized, and couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, and they wore matching cream-colored blouses and shorts that were torn and dirty, and their legs were covered in scratches and blood, and both girls were barefoot and limping, and the look in their eyes was pure fear. Thomas set down his tools and walked slowly toward them with his hands visible because he didn't want to spook them any more than they already were, and the girl in front held a sharp rock in her trembling hand, and she pointed it at him like a weapon. "Stay back," she said, and her voice cracked with exhaustion. "We don't want any trouble, mister." Thomas stopped about 20 feet away, and he took off his hat and held it against his chest like his mother taught him to do when speaking to frightened folks, and he kept his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you girls," he said. "My name is Thomas Wade, and this is my ranch, and you both look like you could use some help." The second girl, who had been holding onto her sister's arm, started to cry, and Thomas could see she was favoring her left ankle. Something fierce, and both girls were sunburned and dehydrated, and looked like they'd been walking for miles. "There's men chasing us," the first girl said, and she glanced back down the road with wild eyes. "Bad men, and they're not far behind." Thomas felt something old and protective rise up in his chest, and it was the same feeling he got 60 years ago when he was just a boy and found an injured rabbit in his daddy's barn, and he'd stayed up all night nursing it back to health. "How many men?" Thomas asked. "3 of them," the crying girl said. "They picked us up when we were hitchhiking near Billings, and they seemed nice at first, but then they drove us out to some cabin in the woods, and they said they were going to," and her voice broke completely. Thomas didn't need to hear the rest, and he'd raised 2 daughters of his own, and they were grown now with families back in Oregon. But he remembered every scraped knee and broken heart, and midnight worry, and these girls standing before him could have been his own. "All right, now listen to me," Thomas said, and he spoke with the calm authority of a man who'd delivered breech calves at midnight and talked down angry bulls and weathered every kind of storm. "You're safe here, and those men aren't going to touch you, and I promise you that." The first girl lowered her rock slightly. "How can you promise that?" "Because this is my land," Thomas said simply, "and I protect what's mine, and right now that includes you 2, and come with me, and we'll get you cleaned up and fed, and then we'll call the sheriff." Something in his voice or maybe in his eyes must have convinced them, because the girl dropped the rock and both sisters started walking toward him, and when they got close, Thomas could see they were identical down to the small scar above their left eyebrows, and they had their mother's eyes, he thought, wherever their mother was. "I'm Sarah," the first girl said, "and this is Emma." "Well, Sarah and Emma," Thomas said, "let's get you inside, and my wife Margaret passed 5 years back, but I still keep a clean house, and there's a bathroom where you can wash up, and I'll make us some coffee." He led them up to the ranch house, which was a modest 2-story place with white trim that Margaret had insisted on painting every other spring, and inside it still smelled like the lavender sachets she used to make. And Thomas showed the girls to the bathroom and found some of his daughter Rachel's old clothes that he kept in a box in the guest room. While the girls cleaned themselves up, Thomas made a pot of strong coffee and pulled out the first aid kit, and he also loaded his Winchester rifle and set it by the front door, because he meant what he said about protecting them. When Sarah and Emma emerged 20 minutes later, they looked more like regular teenagers and less like refugees from a nightmare, and they wore soft sweatpants and loose t-shirts, and Emma had wrapped her ankle with an elastic bandage, and they both had scrubbed the dirt from their faces. Thomas poured them coffee and made sandwiches with thick slices of ham and cheese, and the girls ate like they hadn't seen food in days, and maybe they hadn't. And while they ate, Thomas called Sheriff Martinez, who he'd known since the man was in diapers, Roy. Thomas said when the sheriff answered, "I've got a situation out here, and I need you to come by, and I've got 2 girls who escaped from some men who were planning to hurt them, and the men might be headed this way." Sheriff Martinez asked a few questions and said he'd be there in 15. minutes with the deputy, and Thomas thanked him and hung up, and when he turned back to the girls, he saw Emma was crying again. "What is it, sweetheart?" Thomas asked gently. "Your wife," Emma said, and she pointed to the family photos on the mantel. "Is she really gone? 5 years this October." Thomas said, "Cancer took her, but she fought hard and she was brave right up to the end." "I'm sorry," Emma whispered. "Me too." Thomas said, "Every single day, but she taught me something important, and she taught me that kindness doesn't cost us anything, and that helping folks when they need it is the whole point of being alive." Sarah, who had been quiet, said, "Why are you helping us, and you don't even know us?" Thomas sat down in his worn leather chair, and he thought about how to answer that, and outside he could hear his horses moving in the pasture, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing. "When I was about your age," Thomas said, "I got into some trouble in town, and I'd been drinking, which was stupid, and I got into a fight with some boys from a neighboring ranch, and I was outnumbered 3-1. And there was this old rancher named Dutch Keller who saw what was happening, and Dutch stepped in and he told those boys to move along, and they did because Dutch was respected, and afterward he didn't lecture me or tell my father, and he just said, 'Thomas, everyone needs help sometimes, and don't forget that.' And I never did." "What happened to Dutch?" Sarah asked. "He died the following winter." Thomas said, "Heart attack while feeding his cattle, but I think about him often, and I think about how one moment of kindness changed everything for me. And I went home that night instead of ending up in the hospital or worse, and I straightened myself out after that." The sound of an engine made all three of them look toward the window, and Thomas felt his body tense. But then he saw it was Sheriff Martinez's cruiser, and behind it was another patrol car, and both pulled up in front of the house. Thomas went to the door and stepped out onto the porch, and Roy Martinez got out, and he was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "They inside?" Roy asked. "Yes, and they're scared, but they're safe, and they said 3 men picked them up near Billings." Roy nodded and spoke into his radio, and then he asked, "The men coming here?" "Don't know," Thomas said. "But if they do, they'll regret it." Roy glanced at the Winchester by the door, and he didn't say anything about it because he understood. And he went inside with his deputy, and Thomas followed, and the girls told their story. They'd been running away from a bad foster home in Wyoming, and they were trying to get to their grandmother in Seattle, and they'd been hitchhiking, which they knew was dangerous, but they were desperate, and the 3 men in the truck seemed friendly at first and offered them a ride and food. But after an hour, the men drove off the highway and took them to an isolated cabin and locked them in a room and said terrible things about what they planned to do. And Sarah and Emma had managed to break a window after the men fell asleep drunk, and they'd run through the forest for hours until they found Thomas's road. Roy took notes and called it in, and within an hour there were more deputies searching the area, and they found the cabin about 12 miles north, and the 3 men were arrested before sunset, and they'd been wanted for similar crimes in 3 other states. Through it all, Thomas stayed close to the girls, and when a social worker arrived to take them into custody, Emma started crying again, and she grabbed Thomas's hand. "Please don't make us go back into the system," she begged. "Please." Thomas looked at Roy and at the social worker, who was a tired-looking woman named Patricia, and he said, "What if they stayed here for a bit, and just until we sort out this grandmother situation?" Patricia looked doubtful. "Mr. Wade, you're not a licensed foster parent, and there are procedures." "I understand procedures," Thomas said, "but these girls have been through hell and they need some stability, and I've got plenty of room, and my daughters can vouch for me, and let's just give it a few days while we track down their grandmother." Roy spoke up then. "Patricia, I've known Tom Wade my whole life, and these girls won't find a safer place in Montana, and give him a temporary emergency placement, and we'll sort the paperwork." Patricia looked at Sarah and Emma and saw how they clung to Thomas like he was a life raft, and she sighed and said, 72 hours, and then we reassess." That night, Thomas made up beds in both guest rooms, and he cooked a proper dinner of pot roast and potatoes and biscuits, like Margaret used to make, and the girls ate quietly and kept looking at him like they expected him to disappear. "You know," Thomas said as they cleared the dishes, "my daughters are coming to Vi,